figure of death loomed over Western Europe in the 10th century. It was an age of famine and disease, of pestilence and armed brutality. Many people thought that these horrors were all too familiar, that they knew them from their readings of the book of Revelation, and that this could only mean that the end of the world was imminent. The signs were everywhere, not least in the collapse of social order. The chaos began at the heart of the church, with the papacy, which was riven by factional infighting.
In the 10th century, there were 25 popes. Of those, 11 were deposed, one of them twice. 5 were murdered, 2 were mutilated, and 1 was mutilated posthumously.
Life was as sick at the bottom of society as at the top. In France, the kings, the successors of the great Emperor Charlemagne, had lost control. Local barons were the new warlords, answerable to nobody. They rode out of their fortified castles to plunder from the peasantry as they pleased. Any resistance was answered by brutal violence. With no living authority to exercise the rule of law, the common people turned for help to the dead. The relics of saints, their bones and holy possessions lay in every church, often in caskets of gold and precious stones. The relics were credited with supernatural, miraculous powers. In search of healing and holiness, pilgrims flocked in their thousands to the churches that housed the most important relics, setting up camp outside on holy days and bringing great wealth to the churches. Relics became so important that monks would even resort to stealing them.
If you believed that saints' bones were powerful sources of supernatural power, then you would obviously want to go and get the most powerful ones you could. And you believed that when you got them, you got the power that had previously belonged to another community or another country. So it was a way of bringing in extra supernatural power for your own purposes.
The mere fact that the relics had allowed themselves, the saint, let's say, had allowed him or herself to be brought, was proof that the saint approved. Now, a good example of this is the church at Conques, where the relics of Sainte Foy, who was a little girl Christian martyr in the 3rd century, her relics had been buried in western France at a place called Agen, and those relics were stolen by a monk from Conques who went and lived at Agen in the community there for several years and then made off with the relics. Naturally, the community at Agen wanted them back, but the fact that they had been taken to Conques and reburied and nothing had happened proved to the monks at Conques that Sainte Foy was very happy to be there. And there she stayed.
Relics seemed to offer people a better life on this earth. They prayed to them to bring peace and to free them from their suffering. But their power also extended from this world into the next. Many believed that on the day of judgment, the bones of each saint would reassemble themselves into a whole body and would guide the souls of the saved to heaven.
The only hope for Christians at such a moment was to have powerful protectors in the shape of the saints. And that was why there had been this tendency for churchyards to be focused around local churches and for the faithful to wish to be buried, not just in the churchyard, but better still, in the church, as close to the saint as possible. And I think this physical proximity was seen quite literally as having relevance to the Day of Judgment. This was when your saint would rise from his tomb, her tomb, and lead the virtuous or the hopefully saved into paradise.
While the saved went to heaven, the damned would be consigned to hell. The idea of hell had been a part of Christian belief since the earliest days of the faith, but in the 10th century it assumed a new intensity in the popular imagination. Throughout the Middle Ages, it would inspire dramatic and terrifying paintings and sculptures. Medieval monks would have been familiar with this early description of hell recorded by the 8th century Northumbrian chronicler, the Venerable Bede.
I saw a throng of wicked spirits dragging with them 5 human souls, howling and lamenting into the depths of the darkness, while the devils laughed and exulted. I saw among them one man tonsured like a clerk, a layman and a woman. The wicked spirits dragged them down into the center of the burning chasm, and as they descended deeper, I could no longer distinguish the weeping of the men from the laughter of the devils, but heard only a confused noise in my ears.
Tenth century minds knew hell in vivid and horrible detail. Many people had visions of its terrors. But these supernatural visions could have had a perfectly natural cause. An often fatal condition called holy fire, or ergotism, was sweeping across Europe. Ergotism was caused by a fungus in mouldy rye, which is the same as the active ingredient in the drug LSD. The hallucinations which it caused were widely interpreted as signs of the coming apocalypse. Rodolphus Glaber, a wandering monk and historian, recorded what may have been one of these visions.
A poor man called Lutar became famous. He was probably an envoy of Satan. One day, when he was working alone in a field, he became tired and fell asleep. And then he dreamt that a great swarm of bees entered his body. They came out of his mouth, buzzing loudly and stinging him many times. But when this had gone on for a while, they spoke, ordering him to do things impossible for humankind. Then he went out as though to pray. But when he had entered the church, he seized and broke the cross and image of the Savior.
What we think is ergotism is viewed as being sent by God. And in my mind, I think it's fairly clear that contemporaries saw this as one of the prophecies of the book of Revelation, which is the scorpions who sting, and these flying scorpions who sting you, and you wish you could die, but you don't die. And that's a pretty good description of what it must have been like to be dying of ergotism in this very slow form of agony at the same time as you're having all these hallucinations.
Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth. They were told not to damage the grass of the earth, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were allowed to torture them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torture was like the torture of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death, but will not find it.
The peasants had no choice about eating bread made from contaminated rye. Crops had failed repeatedly, and there was widespread famine throughout Europe. In the face of such devastation, it was hardly surprising that the common people found themselves waiting for the world's destruction.
Some time later, a famine began to ravage the whole earth, and death threatened almost all the human race. Because corpses could not be buried individually, owing to their numbers, in certain places, God-fearing men built what are vulgarly called charnel houses, and into these were thrown corpses, 500 and indeed more if possible at a time, all jumbled together without any order, half naked and without winding sheets. Crossroads and the edges of fields served as cemeteries.
As the year 1000 drew nearer, portents were seen everywhere.
Men thought that the very laws of nature and the order of the seasons were reversed, that those rules which governed the world were replaced by chaos. They knew then that the end of the world had arrived.
There's no doubt at all that some people thought that the coming of Antichrist and the subsequent end of the world was going to take place in the year 1000. There are contemporary accounts of that. And medieval Christians all believed that they were in the fag end of the world. Their chronicles and their charters are always saying, as the world now grows old and cold. Everybody thought they were living at the end of time.
But some people looked forward to the end of time with optimism. Otto III had inherited Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire. He believed that he could bring about Christ's 1,000-year kingdom on earth if he could restore the glory of the old Roman Empire and instill in it a new piety. He moved his court to Rome to begin his reforms. In the year 1000, Otto travelled to Charlemagne's Imperial chapel at Aachen in Germany to enlist the help of his dead ancestor. He ordered his body to be dug up.
Charlemagne had been buried seated on a throne. His body was perfectly preserved and smelt sweet, a sign of sanctity. The only part of his body that had decayed was the tip of his nose. His nails had grown so long, another sign of sanctity, that they had burst through the ends of his gloves.
He cuts his fingernails. They take a tooth, which is what you usually did with relics of the saints. If you open a saint's shrine, you might take a bit for yourself, so it's a relic. And they leave. So they've come to pay homage to the man who they saw as the founder of this new Roman-German Empire.
With Charlemagne's holy power behind him, Otto continued his mission with zeal. Otto's plan was to renew Rome in the image of the New Jerusalem prophesied in the book of Revelation.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God.
But Otto's vision failed. The Roman citizens became tired of his authoritarianism and threw him out. Rome was not to be the New Jerusalem. But the Millennium was bringing a spirit of renewal that would challenge the tyranny of the robber barons in France. Its wellspring was the Abbey of Cluny.
The Abbey of Cluny was founded in 909 in Burgundy, and it became one of the most important monasteries in Western Christendom in the course of the 10th and 11th century. It was a centre of so-called monastic reform, in which the Benedictine rule was taken seriously, and the monks were devoted to a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and the endless round of prayers and chanting, which was their purpose.
They elaborated the liturgy with wonderful Gregorian chant. That's one of the places that the Gregorian music really developed in the 10th century. It gave Cluny enormous prestige, so that other monasteries asked Cluny to teach them how to perform the liturgy. And the customs of Cluny spread all over Western Christendom.
Cluny became the most vigorous force in Western Christianity, inspiring a string of new monasteries throughout Europe. Its monks revitalized a demoralized church. They even eradicated the corruption which had blighted the papacy in Rome. In France, Cluny inspired a great popular movement of renewal, the peace of God. The peace of God united the clergy and the laity and had a profound effect on society. Its aim was to restore piety and order where the robber barons had been running riot.
If you believe that the millennial kingdom is about to happen and God's inspiring you to do it, then you are moved to social and political acts that have enormous consequences. And I think the peace of God is probably the best example of a widespread millennial ferment in action.
Huge numbers of people gathered regularly in the French countryside. They brought with them all their holy relics on which they swore to maintain the peace.
people there swore on oath to protect certain classes of vulnerable person: women, the clergy and monks, peasants in their fields. And they invoked the power of excommunication against anyone who broke those promises.
At one gathering, the following decrees were issued.
1. Anathema against those who break into churches. If anyone breaks into or robs a church, he shall be anathema unless he makes satisfaction. 2. Anathema against those who rob the poor. If anyone robs a peasant or any other poor person of a sheep, ox, ass, cow, goat, or pig, he shall be anathema unless he makes satisfaction.
Such enthusiasm was generated that the bishops raised their croziers to the heavens, and all cried out with one voice to God, "Peace, peace, peace."
As the millennium turned, the popular movements brought a new spirit of piety. Within 30 years, Rudolphus Glaber saw the world newly covered in a white mantle of churches, the fruit of these movements of ordinary people. Strengthened and inspired, the Christian faith had survived the end of the world. Millennial anxiety gradually subsided. But for centuries to come, the medieval mind would remain haunted by those terrifying images of hell and an abiding fear that the Last Judgment was at hand.